It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden streaks across the quiet neighborhood as kids laughed and played on the sidewalk. Among them was a little boy, no older than 10, dribbling a basketball with a wide grin on his face. His name was Jamal, and like most kids his age, he was just enjoying the freedom of the weekend, bouncing the ball against the pavement, lost in his own world. But what should have been a carefree moment was about to take a turn no one saw coming. A police car rolled up slowly, its tires crunching against the asphalt. Officer Reynolds, a man with a hardened face and a reputation for throwing his weight around, stepped out. His eyes immediately locked onto Jamal. Something about the boy, his presence, his confidence, seemed to irritate him. Without warning, he stomped toward him, his hand already resting on his belt as if preparing for trouble. "Hey you," his voice cut through the air, sharp and demanding. Jamal froze, clutching the basketball to his chest. His heart pounded. He hadn't done anything wrong. The other kids on the street stopped playing, their eyes darting nervously between Jamal and the officer. Even the adults nearby hesitated, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. "What are you doing around here?" Reynolds pressed, his expression unreadable. I'm just playing basketball," Jamal stammered, his small voice barely carrying over the tension settling in the air. Reynolds scoffed, shaking his head. "You look like you're up to something." Before Jamal could react, the officer reached forward, snatching the ball from his hands. Jamal's eyes widened. "Hey, that's mine," he protested, his voice laced with confusion and fear. But Reynolds wasn't done. He grabbed Jamal's arm, squeezing tighter than necessary. "You got a smart mouth, huh?" he muttered. That was the moment the sound of another car pulling up broke the tension. A sleek, unmarked vehicle came to a stop just a few feet away. The door swung open, and out stepped a man in uniform, tall, authoritative, and with a presence that demanded respect. Captain Harris, Jamal's father. And in an instant, the look on Officer Reynolds' face shifted from smug confidence to sheer panic. For a moment, everything was still. The kids who had been watching in stunned silence took a few cautious steps back. The neighbors, who had been pretending not to see, suddenly seemed more interested. Even the warm afternoon breeze felt different, heavier, like it was carrying the weight of something bigger than just a little boy and a cop. Jamal looked at his father, a mix of relief and confusion flashing in his young eyes. He hadn't expected to see him, not here, not now. Captain Harris, still in his uniform, stepped forward with a steady but deliberate pace. His face was unreadable, but his presence alone made the air crackle with tension. Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his grip on Jamal's arm loosening as he quickly let go. Captain Harris," he muttered, trying to straighten up as if that would somehow erase what had just happened. Harris didn't respond right away. His eyes flicked to Jamal, scanning him quickly to make sure he was okay. The boy rubbed his wrist where Reynolds had grabbed him, his expression still shaken but trying to stay strong. "Everything all right here?" Harris finally asked, his voice calm but firm. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Just doing my job, sir. Making sure everything's in order around here." His words were careful now, his previous arrogance replaced with something else. Nervousness. Harris let those words hang in the air for a beat too long. The silence made Reynolds shift his weight from one foot to the other. "And what exactly did my son do that required you to put your hands on him?" Jamal could see it now, the way Reynolds' face paled just slightly, the way his fingers twitched like he was scrambling for the right thing to say. "I didn't realize he was your..." "My son," Harris finished for him, taking another step forward. He wasn't raising his voice, but somehow that made it worse. "So you thought it was okay to treat him like this?" Reynolds glanced around, as if looking for an exit. The confidence he had just moments ago, when he was towering over Jamal, was gone. "It was a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "A misunderstanding," Harris repeated, his voice even lower now. He took a breath, his eyes locking onto Reynolds, unblinking. You sure about that? Reynolds opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. The street was silent, every eye locked on them. And in that moment, it was clear this wasn't just about Jamal. This was about something much bigger. Reynolds swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he tried to find a way out of the mess he had just stepped into. The once confident officer, who had no problem intimidating a child, now stood frozen under Captain Harris' unwavering stare. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and the entire neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath. Jamal, still gripping his sore wrist, glanced up at his father. He had seen this look before, the one that meant his dad wasn't just angry, but calculating. Harris wasn't the kind of man to explode in rage. His strength was in his silence, in the way he made people feel the weight of their own actions before he even said a word. "I asked you a question," Harris finally said, his tone even but heavy. "Are you sure this was a misunderstanding?" Reynolds cleared his throat. He hesitated, his eyes darting around as if hoping someone would step in and save him. But the street remained silent, the onlookers unwilling to look away yet too afraid to get involved. "I didn't realize who he was. I thought he was." "Thought he was what?" Harris interrupted, his voice cutting through the officer's excuse like a knife. Reynolds exhaled sharply, realizing there was no right answer to give. "I was just trying to do my job," he finally muttered, but the words felt weak even as he said them. "Your job," Harris repeated, nodding slowly. "And what part of your job requires you to grab a child playing in his own neighborhood?" Jamal watched as Reynolds shifted again, his discomfort growing with every second that passed. He could feel the way his father's words carried weight, the way they demanded accountability without needing to raise his voice. Before Reynolds could answer, another voice cut through the air. "Captain Harris." Everyone turned to see another officer approaching, Sergeant Lopez. He had been Harris' colleague for years, and unlike Reynolds, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from experience, not intimidation. He had likely just arrived, judging by the way his eyes flickered between Reynolds and Jamal, quickly piecing together the situation. "Everything all right here?" Lopez asked, though the way he was looking at Harris suggested he already knew the answer. Harris exhaled through his nose, his gaze lingering on Reynolds for a beat longer before finally turning to Lopez. "Depends," he said simply. "What do you do when you find out one of your officers is abusing their badge?" Lopez's expression tightened slightly, but he didn't look surprised. "We handle it," he said, his voice firm. Reynolds' head snapped toward Lopez. "Come on, Sarge." Lopez held up a hand, silencing him. "Not here," he said. "Not like this." For the first time, Jamal saw real fear in Reynolds' eyes. This wasn't just about what he had done to him, it was about everything else. How many times had Reynolds done something like this before, but no one had been there to stop him? How many kids had walked away without someone to stand up for them? Harris glanced down at Jamal, his expression softening for just a moment before he looked back up at Lopez. "Then let's handle it." Reynolds opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. The weight of his actions was finally settling in, and there was nowhere left to run. The street felt smaller now, like the walls of an invisible courtroom were closing in around Officer Reynolds. His face was stiff, his hands twitching at his sides, but his usual confidence was gone. He knew he was in trouble, real trouble. And for the first time, there was no badge, no authority, no easy excuse that could shield him. Jamal stood close to his father, his heartbeat still uneven from everything that had happened. He could see the way people were watching, their faces a mix of curiosity, concern, and something else, recognition, because this wasn't just about him. It was about all the times someone like Reynolds had done this before, when no one had been there to stop it. Lopez's voice was calm, but firm. "We need to talk, now." Reynolds shook his head slightly, still clinging to whatever power he thought he had left. "Sarge, I don't think you're seeing this clearly," he muttered, his voice lower now, almost desperate. "This is getting blown out of proportion. I thought the kid was." Harris stepped forward before he could finish, his presence alone forcing Reynolds to take a half step back. You thought he was what? His voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous beneath the calm, something that made Reynolds' face tighten. Harris exhaled, shaking his head. How many times, Reynolds? His voice was quieter now, but heavier. How many times have you done this before and walked away like nothing happened? Jamal saw it, the flicker in Reynolds' expression, the split-second hesitation before he looked away. Marshall caught it too. His face darkened as he turned to Lopez. Check his file. Now. Lopez nodded and quickly stepped out of the room. Reynolds shifted on his feet, his breathing slightly uneven. Come on, this is ridiculous, he muttered. I was doing my job. Marshall's eyes narrowed. Your job? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been getting away with things for a long time. A few moments later, Lopez returned, holding a thin folder. He handed it to Marshall, who flipped it open. His expression barely changed, but Jamal noticed the way his fingers tightened on the paper. Marshall took a deep breath before looking up at Reynolds. You want to tell me why this isn't the first complaint against you? The room went still. Reynolds blinked. What? Marshall tapped the folder. Reports of unnecessary force, civilian complaints, even an internal review that somehow got buried. Looks like you've been careful until now. Reynolds' face paled. I didn't. You did, Harris cut in. And you'd have done it again if you hadn't been caught. Jamal swallowed hard. He had known what happened to him wasn't right, but now it was clear. This wasn't just about one bad day. Reynolds had been doing this for years, hiding behind his badge. Marshall closed the folder and looked at Harris. What do you want to do? Harris didn't hesitate. He doesn't belong in uniform. Reynolds stiffened. Wait. Marshall nodded. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending an official investigation. Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, he had no power. As Lopez escorted him out of the room, Jamal felt his father's hand rest on his shoulder again. This time, it felt different. Not just protective, but victorious. But just as they turned to leave, Marshall spoke again. There's one more thing. Harris and Jamal stopped. Marshall hesitated, then looked at Jamal. This wasn't the first complaint against Reynolds, he said, but it might be the first one that finally sticks. Jamal frowned. Why? Marshall exhaled, because this time he picked the wrong kid. Jamal sat quietly as his father and Lieutenant Marshall exchanged a few final words. He could still feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him, but there was something else now, something lighter. For the first time since Reynolds had grabbed him, he felt like he could finally breathe. As they stepped outside the station, the evening air was cooler than before, the sky streaked with fading sunlight. Jamal looked up at his father, searching for the right words. Is he really gone? Harris nodded, his expression firm. For now. And once the investigation is over, he won't be coming back. Jamal thought about that. The idea that someone like Reynolds had been able to get away with things for so long made his stomach twist. What if there are others like him? He asked. His father exhaled, glancing down at him with a look that held both pride and something heavier, experience. There are, he admitted, but that's why we don't stay quiet. That's why we hold people accountable. Jamal let those words sink in. Before today, he had always seen his dad as just his dad, a police officer, sure, but still just the man who helped him with homework, who showed up to his basketball games. Now he saw him differently. He saw what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. As they reached their car, Lopez stepped outside the station, giving them a small nod. Hey, kid, he called out. You did good today. Jamal blinked. I didn't do anything. Lopez smiled slightly. Yeah, you did. You spoke up. That's more than most people do. Jamal wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he just nodded. His father opened the car door for him, and as Jamal climbed in, he realized something. This day, this moment, it would stay with him. Not because of what happened to him, but because of what it meant. It wasn't just about one cop abusing his power. It was about making sure it didn't happen again. As they pulled away from the station, Jamal glanced out the window, watching the city blur past. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. This time, someone had been there to stop it, and maybe next time someone else would find the courage to do the same. Reynolds' mouth opened, then closed. He had no good answer. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The other kids who had been playing earlier were still there, standing just at the edge of the street, their basketball forgotten. A few of the neighbors had moved closer, not saying anything but not leaving either. Jamal felt his father's hand rest lightly on his shoulder, a silent reassurance that he was safe now. But safe wasn't the same as okay. He didn't feel okay. His wrist still stung where Reynolds had grabbed him, and his stomach twisted with the memory of how quickly everything had happened, how fast his entire world had flipped upside down. Lopez exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. "Reynolds," he said, his tone more direct now, "you need to step away. We'll deal with this properly." Reynolds' jaw tightened. He looked at Harris, then at Lopez, then at the growing number of eyes on him. The tension in his shoulders made it clear he was still trying to figure a way out, still trying to hold onto whatever authority he thought he had. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Harris shook his head. "No," he said, his voice steady. "You were abusing it." The weight of those words settled over Reynolds like the final verdict, and for the first time, his expression cracked. His eyes darted between Harris and Lopez, and something shifted in his stance, something restless, something unstable. He wasn't ready to go down quietly. Jamal saw it before anyone else, the way Reynolds' hand twitched toward his belt, the way his body tensed like he was about to make a move. And in that split second, everything seemed to slow down. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He saw it, the quick, almost instinctive motion of Reynolds' hand twitching toward his belt. His father saw it too. In a flash, Captain Harris stepped forward, his voice sharp and commanding. "Don't." The single word cut through the air like a warning siren. Reynolds froze mid-motion, his fingers hovering just inches from his utility belt. His face was tight with frustration, his body tense, as if every instinct was telling him to fight back. But he wasn't just facing a scared kid anymore. He was facing a superior officer, one who wasn't going to back down. Lopez took a step closer, his hand hovering near his own belt, not as a threat but as a precaution. The entire street was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. "Reynolds," Lopez said, his voice low but firm, "think very carefully about your next move." Jamal felt his father's hand tighten slightly on his shoulder, steady but protective. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing: this wasn't over. Then, just when it seemed like Reynolds might back off, another voice entered the mix. "Captain Harris." A second patrol car pulled up, and out stepped Lieutenant Marshall, one of the highest-ranking officers in the precinct. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, quickly assessing the tension, the way everyone stood frozen in place. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice carrying authority. Harris turned to him, but before he could speak, Reynolds took his chance. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding," Reynolds said quickly, his voice suddenly steadier. "I was just trying to ensure neighborhood safety and Captain Harris." "Stop," Harris cut in, his patience wearing thin. "We both know that's not what happened." Marshall's gaze flickered between them before settling on Jamal, who was still gripping his sore wrist. Something changed in his expression. "Inside," Marshall ordered. "All of you, now." Jamal's stomach tightened. This wasn't just going to end on the street. Whatever came next was going to happen behind closed doors, where words carried consequences. Inside the station, the air was thick with unspoken tension. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a cold glow over the room where Captain Harris, Reynolds, Lopez, and Lieutenant Marshall now stood. Jamal sat in a chair against the wall, his legs swinging slightly, trying to act like he wasn't nervous. He knew his father had things under control, but this felt different. This wasn't just about him anymore. Marshall crossed his arms and turned to Reynolds. "Let's get this straight. You put your hands on a child. You escalated a situation that didn't need escalating. And now you expect me to believe this was all a misunderstanding." Reynolds clenched his jaw, but the confidence he had earlier was gone. "Sir, You what?" Marshall pressed, his voice razor-sharp. "Thought no one would notice. Thought you could handle it your way." Reynolds didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said it all.